Hi AppSec engineers. In this video, we're going to be looking at a very important feature of the Amazon or AWS VPC called VPC Mirroring. Let's get started and let's get started now. Important concepts in AWS, especially when it comes to networking in AWS, is the virtual private cloud or the VPC. Now, a VPC is typically where you deploy resources, you create a specific network, or you create a bunch of networks and you deploy resources, systems, and servers inside that network. Now, a VPC is kind of like a private network because you are cordoning off, you can create rules, you can create NACLs, and of course, you can create multiple resources inside of that VPC to be able to reduce access or perform some kind of logical access separation between networks that you have in your Amazon cloud environment. Now, one of the features that's very important from a security perspective for VPCs is VPC mirroring. Now, VPC mirroring essentially is done when you want a copy of the network traffic that's happening inside a VPC. So basically, you have a bunch of network interfaces attached to devices on your VPC, and you want a copy of that network or that traffic in a mirror or a VPC mirror. So the idea here is by using a VPC mirror, what you're doing is you're essentially creating a copy of that network traffic that is coming into your VPC and interfaces on the VPC in another VPC. And what's happening because of that is that you can use the copy and perform all kinds of security analysis on top of it. Now, there are two ways you can do this. One is, of course, you can deploy some kind of security tech inside the VPC itself to be able to prevent and detect attacks. But sometimes this might cause some kind of performance issues. And a lot of times you don't need to necessarily do that inside that VPC itself. You want to be able to do this on a copy of the traffic. And when you do it on the copy of the traffic, it's much more performant. You don't have to worry about it affecting any of your existing VPC services and controls and so on and so forth. As a result, you can do it safely and without too much difficulty. So the idea of a VPC mirror is that you essentially take a copy of your traffic that's coming into a VPC, especially on the interfaces of that VPC, and then you perform security analysis. So you run detection tools like suricata or any of the tools that you'd like to be able to identify potentially malicious traffic or traffic that you deem to be potentially dangerous for your environment. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do a lab on AppSecEngineer on VPC mirroring. And this lab, we're going to look at how VPC mirroring is done. We're going to set up a VPC mirror, and then we're going to perform some malicious activity in that VPC, which means we're going to run a coin miner. We're going to run a crypto mining operation from one of the servers. So imagine that an attacker has compromised a server and they're running some kind of a crypto mining operation. We're going to simulate that. And we're also going to set up a mirror. And on that mirror, we're going to perform analysis using a very popular intrusion detection tool called suricata. Once we do this, you will see that suricata is able to analyze all the traffic that is there in that mirror. So it gets a copy of that traffic, it analyzes the traffic, and then tells you that, hey, this is a coin miner that you have, and your VPC is potentially compromised, or this particular system is potentially compromised. So this is something we're going to be doing as a lab from AppSecEngineer. I'm really looking forward to it. Let's get started without further ado. All right, so let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the courses of AppSecEngineer, and we're going to filter by the learning path. And we're going to go into a course called the Advanced VPC course, right? You'll see that we're going to filter by AWS, and we're going to do an apply. Once we apply, you will be dropped into all the AWS courses that you have. Now, we're going to do the Mastering Advanced Virtual Private Cloud course. It has a whole bunch of labs, it has a whole bunch of videos. And I highly recommend that if you are somebody who's looking at an intermediate or an advanced course for VPCs, and if you have access to AppSecEngineer, definitely do this. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go into the VPC mirroring lab, and we're going to be using AppSecEngineer for the entire lab. And if you have access to AppSecEngineer, especially the Pro Plus, you have access to the AWS Sandbox as well. So we're going to be using the AWS Sandbox for this. So let's get started. I'm going to start up the lab. And while I'm starting up the lab, you will see that the AWS instructions that you have at AppSecEngineer are pretty detailed. You have every single detail that you can create on your own. You can do a DIY mode or you can do a pre-written approach. Now, I'm going to explain this from a pre-written approach perspective, simply because I already know the concept and I just want to explain how this works to everybody that we have, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the lab. We're going to spin up an AWS account. We're going to deploy some resources using Terraform. Once we do all of that, we will see that we're going to simulate an attack and then perform a VPC mirror based analysis for that attack, right? So here we're almost done with the lab creation. You should see that the lab should be created in the next few seconds. And once it's done, we should have access to a whole bunch of stuff with this lab. So what we're going to do is first spin up our AWS account and walk us through the code. Let's walk through the code and see how it works. So we're going to spin up, we're going to create a new terminal and a cctl inits. So this is going to spin up a new AWS account for us. And you can see that we can log into this new AWS account. Let's actually log in. So this is the sandbox feature for those of you who are still not sure about how this works. The sandbox feature where you get a full AWS account to deploy it from AppSecEngineer. We're going to log into AWS and then we are going to deploy this using Terraform. So the username is this, password is this. Let's get started. So now that we have our AWS account created and we all have the environment set up, let's go ahead and look at the code. So you'll see that VPC mirroring is what we want to do. Now you'll see that there are a whole bunch of resources in VPC mirroring. Now, and you'll see that the instructions give you quite a bit of detail as to how this works, right? We are essentially going to create multiple VPCs. We're going to take a requester VPC and an acceptor VPC, right? The idea is that there are two VPCs. One is going to be the main VPC, one is going to be the mirrored VPC, which is going to get the copy of the traffic, right? The mirrored VPC just gets the copy of the traffic. We're going to be deploying this in the US West 2 region. We're going to create the VPC, a bunch of VPCs. We're going to create two VPCs with cider blocks. We're going to have some specific number of VPCs that we're going to create. We're also going to create something called a VPC peering connection, right? The idea is that you want the same traffic to be available on both VPCs, so you need to have a peer VPC. It's like a peer-to-peer type of thing, a peer VPC. So that's what we're doing here. We're going to create a peer VPC. We're going to create a subnet for the requester VPC, right? This is the requester VPC where that is going to have the actual mirror of the traffic. And we are also going to create an acceptor VPC, which is going to be another VPC where we're going to be deploying our environments and stuff like that. We're going to create a public subnet, a private subnet. We're also going to create a NAT gateway. This is not always necessary. A NAT gateway is quite expensive, but this is just for this particular lab, we're just going to go with the NAT gateway and figure out how to use that NAT gateway. So the NAT gateway is going to be us using this for internet access, obviously. So that is why we're using a NAT gateway. And we're also going to create a route table because we want the connection between the multiple VPCs to work together, right? So we're going to create a VPC peering. So that's why we need to create a route table to accept the traffic between the two VPCs, right? So it routes the traffic to the internet and the acceptor VPC through the peering connection. So that's why the peering connection works, because we have the route table set up. The same thing needs to be set up on the acceptor VPC. And so there's quite a bit of setup, as you can see, that you need to do for this to work, right? So you can't just do this by clicking a button. You need to actually set it up and configure it in the right way. So we're creating the route tables, and then we're associating the route tables. We are also creating security groups. So what we're going to simulate is that we're going to simulate an attacker compromising the server. So imagine the attacker has compromised the server somewhere, and then they're going to run a crypto mining operation. So in this case, since you're not going to attack it in the real sense, we're going to SSH into this, and then we're going to run that crypto mining operation. So that's what we're doing here. That's why we're allowing port 22 access, and we're allowing all egress access, right? So that's basically what we're doing for this. So we're creating security groups with the public instances, the private instances, all of that stuff. We are also going to create our application. We are going to create a database host in the private subnet and so on. And once we are done with this, we are going to create a mirror. So you really need to think about all the stuff that we're doing till now. We're first creating the VPCs, we're creating the route tables, we're creating the security groups. Then we are creating the mirror. We are essentially saying that the mirror is set up between the instances. Now, remember, the mirror is just not the VPCs itself. The mirror is set up for the network interface of the instances, which is why it's bound to the network interface of the instance. So the application instance that we're using to actually attack, that network interface is going to be mirrored between both the VPCs. So that's what's happening. It's not just the entire VPC traffic, because imagine doing that. That'll actually be a huge amount of traffic, especially with some kind of VPCs. You might have thousands of hosts in that VPC or thousands of resources in that VPC. So the VPC mirroring is being done for the instance network interface. And that's what you'll see here. It's being done for the instance network interface, and that's what we're doing here. So this is all of the code that you can study here, and you can do this DIY. I'm not going to do this DIY. I'm just going to jump into this directly and get started with this. So I'm going to move this to another screen, and I'm going to get started with actually running this lab. So here I am going to first terraform init, and we're going to do terraform apply with an auto approve, which is going to give us the entire setup, whatever we need for this to work. So we're going to apply it. Now you'll see that the code base has the same stuff that we just explored in the DIY segment of the lab instructions. So the cool thing with AppSecEngineer Labs is that you can do this yourself, or you can do this with a pre-built setup. So you don't need to worry about too much here. So this is creating all of the different resources. It's creating your NAT gateway. It's creating your subnets. It's creating your application instance. It is also creating the security groups. It's creating the routing tables. It's creating, let's look at the resources, because this is where, yeah. So this is our public instance of the application. So we're just creating this EC2 server, and this is going to be associated with the subnet. Now, this is the one that we're actually monitoring on the mirror, right? So if you look at the mirror, this app inst create is what we're monitoring. We're essentially taking the app create inst, and we're monitoring that as the, and we're essentially taking all the traffic. You can also create a mirror filter. You can essentially say that I only want certain types of traffic. So let's say you have very specific type of traffic that you want to filter for in the mirror. So that will actually reduce the amount of potential things that you can monitor against, which is good in some ways if you can do that, but sometimes you may not be able to do that. That's why we are creating the mirror with all enabled, right? This is just an example to show you that all enabled. Rule in, rule out. This is going to be accept ingress, accept egress. You need to set up a mirror for ingress and egress traffic, which you need to monitor for, right? That is what you're doing here. And you're also going to set up another server for suricata, right? Now, suricata, it's an intrusion detection tool. You can actually check this out online. Suricata is a very powerful intrusion detection tool that you can give network traffic to. It can be set up, of course, in this case, we're not setting this up in line. We are essentially going to give it recordings of the network flows, and it will essentially give us some idea of whether something is compromised or not. So this is open source, which is why we're using this in our course. So done. We actually have a fully set up service now. We have all of the VPC set up. We have created a whole bunch of resources, and yeah, that's, we have the IP addresses for the public IP. This is what we're going to log into. So this is the application public IP, which we are going to compromise. We're going to compromise this and perform a crypto mining operation on this, and then we're going to see with suricata whether it caught that and whether it was able to detect the attack that happened. All right. So now let's actually go into and log into the suricata service. We're going to change the IP address to the suricata IP address, which is this, and say yes. So we're in. So we're going to add a few rules here. We're going to check out a few rules. So we are going to set up some suricata rules. The first thing we are going to do is actually, let me use sudo vim. I'm not a big nano guy. I don't know why I've never used nano all that much. I'm just going to use vim. Hopefully, yeah, vim is so much easier. I'm just going to copy some rules over. Now, this rule, the first rule is going to be a DNS rule. Let's look at what this rule essentially does. So you'll see that this rule is a crypto miner rule. Now, if a DNS request is observed to the crypto mining domain pool.minergate.com, then this rule is triggered. So this is the first rule that we have that we are going to be checking for and triggering for. Then the next rule that we're going to be checking for is the same thing, except that we're going to use the, so the first rule was the offset. The next rule is a DNS query where you have the pool.minergate.com, and we're checking for the DNS query to this particular, and we're also giving it a class type, Trojan activity, and so on. We're setting it up. The first one is being set up as an offset. The second one is being set up as a DNS query. Slightly different rules, but doing the same thing, right? So this is what we are setting up here. and then we are going to save the file and we will restart Suricata. So this is us restarting Suricata. Should be done. Let's check whether it's actually started or not. All right. So we've started the service. Suricata is running. Now we are going to tail the logs and see what it's finding, right? So far, there's nothing here. In the meantime, let's go into another terminal and we are going to log into the application server through an SSH. So this is us compromising that server and running crypto mining from that server. So imagine that I am running a crypto mining operation from that server. So this is me doing that. We don't put in the public IP here. So I think we're good. So we're in, right? So now we have set up the two instances. This is Suricata. We're going to monitor it from the log. You can set up a UI and stuff like that with Suricata. You can give it a nice little front end, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to focus on actually making sure that our miner code is working. So now I'm going to run the miner and essentially say that start running the crypto miner on this server. So it's going to run both crypto miners on the server, and you'll see that immediately because it has the VPC mirror traffic and it's being fed in directly into that the secondary VPC and the network interface is captured, you will see that a network trojan was detected, priority one, and immediately you are able to detect this because you have the VPC mirroring setup. This can give you an idea of the power of VPC mirroring, right? Especially if you have a good understanding or a good threat model of your network security and your network traffic. This is a great way to be able to identify attacks. You can even trigger some kind of events based off of this, and you can do a whole bunch of things to enrich this. And so you can even start auto containment. So one of the things that we teach in many of our courses, in fact, in our Blackhat course that we're doing in August, we have auto containment set up where attacks like this can be detected and it can trigger an AWS Lambda function that will auto block access to that host and will automatically secure that host and not allow anybody to access it and so on. So that makes it very, very effective when you want to think about incident response and so on and so forth based off of things like this. So this is really powerful stuff that you can see that we have been able to do because of VPC mirroring. And all this is possible because there is VPC mirroring, and since there is VPC mirroring and it is able to filter and you're able to put in for a specific network interface, it makes it so much more optimized rather than just you having to do inline security analysis. You can actually do this, and you can do this for very low effort because of open source tools like Suricata. So this is one of the things that you can do with VPC mirroring. So there you have it, folks. We looked at VPC mirroring. We looked at how it can be used very effectively from a security perspective. We looked at a real world use case of how you can use VPC mirroring to identify potential security anomalies with your network traffic, and how you can load rules with tools like Suricata, even open source tools like Suricata to make it very effective. VPC mirroring, among other VPC capabilities, are very important for you to maintain a very strong security posture, especially for network security inside your AWS environment. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in another video.